Hey, Justin, thank you so much for being here today. We're so grateful that we get to interview you. I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, so just for starters, thanks, Courtney, for having me. I mean, big fan of you, big fan of the show. I just feel so privileged to be here, so grateful to be here. As for myself, so my name is Justin Germain. That's my actual name. We were kind of talking in the preamble here, but I'm publishing and writing under the name Demitrios Lopez, which actually goes into a little bit of kind of like myself and just getting to know me. So I teach ancient Greek and Latin at a university in Dallas, Texas, and some ancient history. I'm a quarter Greek myself. I say my family's very American Greek, right? So like, don't think my big fat Greek wedding or anything like that. It's like they'll eat feta, they'll drink ouzo, but that's about as far as kind of the Greekness goes. But I've always had a great affinity just for the language, the culture, the whole nine yards. And so when I thought about writing a book and having a pen name, I wanted something that sort of honored like my professional job, teaching Greek and sort of my family heritage. So I thought Demitrios was a very, very good Greek name. And then my father's last name was Lopez, and I'm from Dallas, Texas. Grew up kind of in the blistering summers here. Been around, had some different experiences, lived overseas a while in Ecuador. I was in the military, both active duty and reserves, and now I'm here. I'm teaching and writing this book. So, and the reason I decided to go with the pen name was initially I kind of had this image. J.K. Rowling tells this story about when she was going to, first publishing Potter, like this sort of like plotting it and planning it in darkness, and like she was just going to publish it and kind of disappear, right? She didn't want to be this great celebrity, and that was kind of like my idea. But I have discovered that in order to sell a book, like you got to market it, and traditional publishing, self-publishing, like it doesn't matter. Like you have got to do 99% of the work. And in my case, I'm like, my face is going to be out there, so I might well use my real name, but I went with Demitrios Lopez, and so that's it. That's my author name, and that's a bit about my intro.
Amazing. I would love if you could tell us what your book's about.
Okay, so my book is the first in a fantasy sci-fi amalgamation series. The title is Sigma, is in just the Greek letter sigma. Again, back to my classical roots there. Sigma Book One, Thumos Rising. And the way I describe this book is kind of twofold. On one hand, it really is a mashup of both traditional fantasy and sci-fi tropes, symbolism. So there's one part in the book where you have this major set battle between dragons and aircraft, and they're attacking this airborne battle station, right? That's just hovering up there in the sky. So you have the dragons, but you have the advanced technology, right? The aviation technology. We also have magic just writ large, working alongside advanced technology. You have advanced weaponry on the battle, sharing a battlefield with swords and armor and those kind of things. And you might be wondering how that all makes sense and stays together inside of a story. I would just say when you pick up the book, it'll make sense, right? The devil's kind of in the details there. So for people that really enjoy that kind of genre literature, be it the fantasy or the sci-fi, I think they're really going to love it. I try to pitch the book as it's kind of a combination of Dune meets Game of Thrones. If you're a little bit more nerdy, it's maybe a combination of like the H.G. Geiger Aliens meets Conan the Barbarian. In a little way, it doesn't quite have that high sort of arc that say Game of Thrones or Dune does, but that's the basic idea. The other thing I would say about this book is it ultimately is it's an allegory for ancient Stoicism. And again, getting back to part of just what I do for a living, the main character is a man named Zeno, and the central question, not just in this book, but really going forward for the entire series, is can this individual, because he eventually is gifted these very godlike powers. He's very much a messianic character. Again, think Paul Atreides, think Superman, think Jesus, right? But can he go from being fully human to being this god and yet maintain his humanity, right? Or is it just sort of a fact that the higher you go, when you go to that 10,000-foot view, well, all of a sudden the individual life just doesn't look as valuable as it once did. And you're seeing the grand scheme of things, and you start sort of making these Faustian bargains. And is there something in the process that just intrinsically dehumanizes you? And that's the central question. And that's what we have to find out, following the story and seeing what happens to Zeno.
Love that. What inspired you to write your book?
So, this is gonna be my 50 Shades of Grey moment. And I don't know if this is actually true, but I'd always heard this, so I guess if it's a lie, I'm perpetuating the lie, I'm sorry. That 50 Shades started out as Twilight fanfic. Again, don't know if it's a fact, I could certainly see it. This started out as fan fiction. I'm a child of the '80s, the early '80s, and as a kid, I loved He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Just absolutely loved it, and in some way, it was very much a gateway drug to, again, things like the Conan short stories of Robert E. Howard, to the, H.P. Lovecraft, sort of existential space horror. I mean, for me, like, I wouldn't consider myself a massive Star Wars fan, but I became a Star Wars fan in so much. Like, again, He-Man was sort of the on ramp to all those things. And I remember at one point I was in my late 20s and I was walking around Barnes and Noble and I was just like, you know what? I want to read a He-Man story. So, something that's, again, based on the characters from the cartoon, but a little bit more adult, that takes a little bit more seriously, higher stakes and whatnot. And of course, you see this all the time with things like Star Trek and Star Wars, right? I mean, it's like you have all these canon stories that are built out of, the individual shows and movies, whatever it may be. And I just remember Courtney being shocked going into the Barnes and Noble. Again, I guess this is maybe sort of proof of my sort of fandom solipsism here, but I was just shocked that there wasn't a He-Man book. I'm just like, I know there's not a, you know, it's not as big as some of these other IPs, but surely there'd be one book, and there just wasn't. And I remember just being very offended by that. And I immediately went home and started writing again. I mean, this was like very, very embryonic stages, but basically started piecing together what ultimately became the story for book one. It was the He-Man story that I wanted to read. And as I kept working on it, I said, well, you know what? I'm putting a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this. I really love this story. But some of this He-Man mythology that I'm sort of like playing with and working with, it's kind of holding me back. So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to make it completely my own. I'm going to take this story. I'm going to break away from these other characters and sort of the I guess the boundaries that the original inspiration had, and I'm going to make it its own thing. And then the next thing you know, you have a book, and and you're looking for a publisher, and so here we are.
Amazing. When you were writing your book, who were you thinking of when it comes to who your book is for?
This is going to sound so self-serving. I mean, listen, I wrote the book for me. I wrote the book that I would want to read. I guess that's the short of it. And I don't know if that's sort of a good thing or a bad thing, Courtney. I mean, because again, when you start talking to publishers and that kind of thing and marketers, I mean, that's, of course, that's $1 million question. Okay, who is this book for? And I got advice at one point. It's like, have an individual in mind, write the book for them, and then, of course, out there in the big wide world, there are going to be many people like them, and that's how you find your basic fan base, your foundational audience. And then, again, if the work is quality, it will grow from there through word of mouth and these other means. And I guess I did follow that advice to a large degree. It's just that, like, the individual was me. I wanted to write the kind of story that I would be interested in reading, and again, my sort of, I guess, brand of sort of nerd would be interested in reading. And then as I was just, again, I think part of being a writer is I haven't met one writer that isn't a reader too, right? So reading things like The Mist of Avalon was very inspirational for me. Madeline Miller, big fan of hers. Circe, Song of Achilles, sort of expanding out beyond like the Tolkiens and the Robert E. Howards of the, and some of that kind of higher, foundational fantasy kind of stuff. I wanted to be something that sort of like the foundational audience might be someone like me, but something that could aspire, that could transcend, and something that absolutely that someone that is vastly different, has a vastly different life experience from mine, could sit down, read, and they could see something just universal about the human experience there that would touch them and speak to them.
Love that. How long have you been writing and what made you really sit down and start?
So, I mean, at this point, I would say about 10 years. Um, and I think this is fairly common. I think a lot of authors have a similar story where, like, when you first sit down and put hands to the keyboard, it's you haven't got it fully worked out yet. You've got this idea of the story in your head. You're kind of in some ways writing by the seat of your pants, almost as if you don't get it on the page right now, you're going to forget it. It's going to be gone, and it's like you'll never have it again, right? So I can distinctly remember being in Rome on an academic trip in 2014, walking around the museum. Again, so many of the art pieces inspired by mythology, and then thinking through ideas for the book. I mean, I can also honestly tell you that, like, even as a kid, again, being sort of inspired by He-Man, as young as 8 or 7, like playing with my He-Man toys and playing out kind of the basic plot of this first book, at least, right? Even as a kid. So the wheels had been turning for a really long time. I would say I got really serious about it in 2014. And from then it was a point of like writing the book, then converting it from the fanfic to my own thing. And then once you have your first draft, you got to read it again. You're sending it out to other readers. Once you get an editor, and I gotta say, like, my editor was an absolute, godsend. Like, she came in and she said, look, there's a lot of good things here, but there are things we need to correct, and let that be sort of a lesson to anyone that's writing. It's your first draft is just that, a first draft, right? Like, there's still so much work to do, and you can't just get discouraged, right? Like, if someone reads your first draft and say, okay, yes, 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 but also no, 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 like, it's all a learning process, like, it's a building process. And so that's where I am now. I think that first book is sort of like, at least in my case, is the big hump to get over. The second book came much more quickly, and I've just sort of broke ground on the third book, writing it as we speak.
Love that. What is your schedule like when you are writing a book?
So in terms of a daily writing practice, I don't know, people, I've heard different things. Like, some people have like word counts, and like, I guess for me, I was always a big fan of just, okay, putting the timer on my phone, throwing the phone like to the other end of the room. I don't need to be checking my text. I don't need to be on Instagram or anything like that. And just actually setting down and just getting engrossed in the story, right? And another one of my favorite authors, Stephen Pressfield, talks about, it's very often, it's like you're writing, but you don't feel like it's coming. Sometimes you need to just stare at a page for an hour. Sometimes you need to spend 2 hours working on like one paragraph. Like, it just has to happen. But I do believe that if you faithfully honor the muses, I think they eventually reward their worshipers. I do think there's just something poetic and true about that. You just sort of like got to keep with it, right? So for me, I try to put 2 hours on the clock to work on the book. Now, that may not just be writing. That may be, now, in the book's releasing in July 15th. So thinking about marketing it, making videos again for social media, or doing interviews, or reaching out to bookstores, or all those things are included. But just 2 hours of really focused effort on the book, and I try to do that 5 days a week.
Love that. What do you need in your writing space to help you stay focused?
I almost feel like I could answer the question better by like what I don't need, right? I think I was like throwing the cell phone to the other end of the room. Like, I definitely don't need those kind of distractions. I need my dog. I'll say that. Like, I need my puppy. It's just not quite the same without her. Um, I feel like I need darkness. I do my best work either before or after sunrise, especially in regards to writing, I feel like. Um, and music is a big plus. I wouldn't say it's mandatory, but it definitely helps get me in the mood. And I might be the only person in America that doesn't have Spotify. I'm still using Pandora. But I'll put on instrumental music, or I'll put on, some kind of channel of my favorite artist, and that could include anything from like just, two cellos to Taylor Swift, right? I mean, she run the full gamut, right? Like whatever I'm in the mood for. And sometimes Courtney, I'm in the zone, I'm really feeling it, like the words are flowing, and then all of a sudden, some commercial will come on trying to sell, because it's Pandora, right? Like trying to sell like Tide Pods or something like, and it just totally breaks the spell. But music is helpful, not necessary. I guess for me, it's almost like meditation. Like I just have to just put myself in a headspace to this is what I'm focusing on right now, and it's very much kind of a workman's kind of attitude, whether you feel like it or not. Going to the gym, in this case, setting yourself to the computer.
Love that. What is your favorite writing snack and drink?
Favorite writing snack and drink. Gosh, I guess I'm so boring. I guess I could be very tongue in cheek and say vodka, right, for the favorite drink. But I feel like so many authors have already got that covered. Um, I generally okay. I mean, I guess I should have included this in the previous question. I generally have a giant jug of water with me when I'm writing. I actually can't really drink too much because I'll just get sleepy, and I don't drink coffee. That's something like, well, how can you get sleepy if you're like chugging caffeine? I guess that's the thing. I don't chug caffeine, at least not yet. Maybe that day's coming, but it's not here yet. As far as a snack goes, cheese, just cheese all the way. Gouda if I've got it, but I mean really kind of anything, even cheese product. Like I'll take one of those Velveeta like slice, thing if that's what I've got, right? But I generally try to stay pretty well stocked on cheese.
Love that. What type of books do you personally enjoy reading?
I got to be honest with you, I'm really kind of all over the place. Okay, I guess again, I'm writing in and I would say the book is more fantasy than sci-fi. One of the ways I've like talked about the book is it's more Star Wars than Star Trek, right? And that I feel like Star Wars is really just sort of a fantasy that happens in space in a sci-fi setting. For me personally, I do and I have read so much fantasy. Again, growing up, I've referenced it before, but the Robert E. Howard short stories were a very big inspiration for me. I can tell you right now that sort of in the queue, I've got an Emily Henry book. I can't think of the title. I think it's Funny Story. I think that's the one that's like up next in the queue. I'm currently reading a book, and I can't think of the author's name off the top of my head. But Ripe is just a very like in-depth character study about a woman working in Silicon Valley and struggling with depression. Like very hard hitting, very real. And again, just those two books alone, right? I mean, you're seeing sort of the gamut, like very, very serious and somber to like literally the title of the book is Funny Story. And again, I haven't read it yet. Maybe it's not that funny. I don't know. But like knowing Emily Henry, it's like it's probably like you probably have a lot of good chuckles in there. Again, I've got Dune on my bookshelf, right? I mean, a lot of people do. Again, I mentioned him before, huge Stephen Pressfield fan. The book Gates of Fire, I read it when I was an undergraduate in college, absolutely changed my life. I never would have imagined that I'd be teaching Greek or Latin, but someone gave me that book. I read that book, fell in love, and it's about the Greco-Persian War. Focuses on the Spartans, focused specifically on one Spartan family. I read that book, just sort of became enamored with the ancient Spartans, and they're just so odd. And then I was like, I got to learn about all the Greeks, and then it's like I got to learn about the Romans. Next thing you know, you're teaching Greek and Latin, right? So, but almost all of his stuff I've read, including the nonfiction stuff. I'll say that too. Like I do consume probably a lot of nonfiction. It's probably about 50-50.
Love that. Are there any books or authors that inspired you to become a writer?
Again, I guess I have to like go back to specific Stephen Pressfield and Madeline Miller, right? So the thing that I admired just so much about Pressfield was, and just, I read that book and just sort of blown away. But at first, I mean, just like, well, I don't know this guy, right? There's just this book that I love so much. I've gone back to it through several of the very difficult periods in my life. When my mother died, I read, that book, Gates of Fire, again. When I got divorced, I read Gates of Fire again. Anytime there's been a real challenge, it's like I've gone to it for strength. But then getting to know the author and reading some more of his works, I mean, he has a very interesting story. Like he had this period where he was homeless, right? I mean, just really sort of like struggling. He was 51 years old before he ever made a penny writing. and now like he's had films turned into movies, and he's been this best-selling author. But he just very much has this ethos, and he has this phrase like, put your ass where your heart wants to be. And I think that's true for writers. I think that's true for anything. If you want to be and in my case, wanting to write this book, it was a matter of just like literally setting down and putting again, as we talked about earlier, putting myself in a space to write the book, right? The other great inspiration was, again, Madeline Miller, just because we kind of come from a similar background in terms of, our formal education. Again, she's a classicist. She does, Greek and Latin and mythology and history, and I do that as well. Seeing the way she took those stories and added new things, brought in new characters, but still stayed true, and was able to, in some ways, I think, tell the myths in a truer way than the original myths, right? That really landed. To me, I think that's the power of genre literature, right? I mean, it's very difficult if you were going to write a book on some kind of, again, I'll just go back to the book that I'm reading right now, set in Silicon Valley. Your criticisms or praises about, the tech industry, it's going to seep its way into the book, right? No matter what. But if you take maybe a similar environment, but put it on Mars, or put it on a different planet, or put it, in some kind of else world, right? It's like an emotion pump, right? And so you can get at the same ethos in a much sharper way, I feel like, than you could if you're telling a story about the real world, because look, the real world is just so complicated, right? But in some ways, and that's not that the fictional stories aren't complicated. I mean, that's what makes them great. I mean, they are obviously complicated as well. At the same time, there's a chance, I think, for clarity that you don't get if you're writing about, say, I don't know, contemporary New York or something like that. So Miller, I think, was masterful at that. And Pressfield was just such a great inspiration for the workmanship of writing. And I'd say I would not have written this book had it not been for both of their influences on me.
Love that. What books did you grow up reading? Did you have an all-time favorite?
As a kid, ooh, um, see, I was just too old when the Harry Potter, like, Percy Jackson thing. I still haven't read Percy Jackson. I plan to read it with my daughter, right? And everyone's just shocked. Was like, "You teach and you haven't read Percy Jackson?" I was like, "Yeah, I know. Every demigod knows a little Latin." I've gotten so many students over the years. Um, I feel like I'm coming back to the same names, but I gotta say, just as a kid, I just ate up Robert E. Howard, right? Again, growing up, and I'll qualify this statement, but growing up kind of relatively poor, and again, I did grow up in a single parent home. There was something about kind of the Wild West aspect of that, and just sort of the world that I was in, and very much not feeling in control of it. And then for Robert E. Howard's author story, right? And he has his own very beautiful and tragic story about his writing, coming up in kind of literally in the Wild West, right? And seeing how like for him, it was creating these characters that just their superpower was their ability to endure. There was no horror that Conan couldn't behold, that he's like, okay, listen, I've got my sword, I've got my soul, I'm gonna be okay, right? And I mean, again, I don't know. Maybe I guess you can obviously take that too far in a lot of ways too, right? But in some way, there's just something so beautiful about that. And so as a kid, that it was an escape for me, but it also gave me hope. And my favorite story, I guess pre-18 favorite book that I read was Conan the Conqueror, which was Howard's only full-length novel about the Conan character. Everything else was short stories. But there was just so much in that just totally captured not just the character, not just the soul of that character, but so much the soul of the author. And it just spoke to me as a young man.
Love that. On the other side of that, now as an adult, what are your favorite series or authors that if they come out with something, you automatically grab it?
Ooh, well, again, the names I've already mentioned: Stephen Pressfield, Madeline Miller. In respect to series, again, this is going to sound so like bandwagonish, um, but Sarah J. Maas. I mean, like all of that stuff, right? Is just like so incredibly good. I guess, and this might be, I don't know how controversial this would be. And I don't know if I would pick up to the point where I'd pick up anything that she wrote, but I always had a soft spot for Twilight over Harry Potter, right? I guess if you ask me if you put sort of those two like next to each other, I don't know, that's maybe my, I guess, sort of fandom, sort of book club hot take there. There you go. But yeah, I mean, all those books have been great. Like I will say that like for series specifically, it's one of those things where I have picked up series and I've stopped, right? Because I mean, there's just so many things to read, and I feel like sometimes we keep reading like some of the like a sunken cost fallacy. It's like, oh, I'm so far, like I've got to find out like how it ends. And there have been times where I was just like, okay, I want to know how it ends, but just for whatever reason, this book hasn't been doing it for me for about 100 pages now. It's like, okay, look, I'm going on Reddit, or I'm going to go something else. I'm kind of cheating, but it's like, but there are other series to get to, right? And other books to get to, and just now, I mean, it does sort of feel like almost an embarrassment of riches because there are just so many great authors and so many great series out there. It's almost like you just throw a rock and you can find a great one right where it lands.
Love that. What would you tell someone just starting out with reading again?
With reading. Um, okay, for reading, I would say read what you love. Read what you love, but what you don't know. And I guess what I mean by that, I guess that's how can you love something you don't know? But okay, if I might give an analogy, if you have sort of a college freshman, right, that's coming in, and maybe, she's never had any exposure to astronomy, right? But yet she takes an intro astronomy course, and like she doesn't know anything like really about black holes or dark, right? I mean, we don't know all that. We can't name all the constellations, but it's just there's sort of this moment of of kind of falling in love where you look up at the stars for the first time and you really try to observe them, and you're like I can't look away. I would say what someone that's trying to get back into reading or trying to like establish a reading practice, find something that you can't look away from, but that you don't know, and that you really are sort of like walking into a different world. And so everything is new, everything is fresh, everything is a bit of a surprise. And the only thing you really know about it is that you have to know more. I think we all have that experience of like picking up a book and just not being able to put it down. Almost to the point where it's like you're showing up late for work, right? And it's like you're not getting things done because you have to find out if it's fiction, what's happening on the next page. If it's nonfiction, it's like you have to sort of like fully flesh out this argument. And I think that's how people get addicted to books. And it's the best, I think the best possible addiction to have.
Love that. On the other side of that, what would you tell someone just starting to write their own book?
I guess going back to something I said earlier, I really think you have to write the book that you want to read. And here's why, right? Because there has to be something intrinsic within you that brings you back to the grindstone, that brings you back to the workshop day after day, month after month, year after year. There has to be something intrinsic in you that, again, if you're going the self or not the traditional publishing route, because look, you're going to get rejected, right? I mean, J.K. Rowling tells these stories, right, about all the rejection letters, right? Um, I think I heard George R. R. Martin talking the other day about Ray Bradbury supposedly had a whole closet that he wallpapered it with his rejection letters, right? And like these are the greats. So they got rejected. You're going to get rejected. Like it is what it is. And even if you objectively write the best book in the world, someone's going to read that and be like, I don't see what the big deal is. Right. So all that to say is you've got to love the process and you've got to love the story. And I just know for me, I very much had this sense of once I had the outlines and the basic character arcs in place in my head, not just for the first book, but in many ways for the entire series, Zeno's story had to be told. Alexandra, who's another character in the book, her story had to be told. Even the antagonist, like the stories just demanded to be told. And I felt this great obligation, but also this excitement to make sure I do their stories justice, right? And I think that's you have to be a little you have to be driven in a kind of crazy way, but with a lowercase c, right? Not with an uppercase c, but with just a little bit of a lowercase c. If you're writing, I get if you're writing for fame and glory, it's almost probably guaranteed that the fame and glory is not going to happen, right? If you're writing for everyone else, like okay, what's going to please everyone else? Again, I don't know. Not to say that it can't hit. I mean, all kinds of things hit all the time for all kinds of reasons, but I mean, I think you have to be like very true to yourself, right? And when you start writing by committee, that pulls you away. So I would say you have to stay faithful to that internal muse, no matter what.
Love that. What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you?
I think they're generally surprised to find out about sort of my background. I, I I I don't know. I mean, even the term classicist, and again, that just refers to like people that study the classics again from the Greco-Roman world, right? If you go to a classical studies department, like they're reading Plato or they're reading Virgil, or that's what they're doing. But even the name, I think, invokes. I don't know. I mean, it invokes like these very sort of like high end, cocktail parties where just everyone is drinking these sort of very fancy cosmopolitan drinks, and everyone is being very sort of proper with how they put their relative pronouns and not to end sentences in certain ways. And in some ways, I never have and still don't fit into that mold, right? I just think a lot of people don't think of, I don't know, like a kid from again a poorer community from a single parent home, teaching Greek. It's a bit of an odd story. I would just say I haven't run into a lot of people just in the field that are like that. And when you start talking to be it students or other colleagues, and you start actually sharing your life, trying to make real human connections, people are like, oh wow, that's very interesting. Well, like, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that? You know. I don't know. At the same time, it always strikes me as weird that other people think it's weird because, when it's your experience, it's just all right? So I guess it is kind of this weird paradox that's sort of always operating in the periphery.
Love that. Is there anything you would like to say or add?
Yeah. So in respect to the book specifically, again, the book is releasing in days now on July 15th. So obviously very excited. It's been, a lot of work, not just in the writing, but also, as I said, in the publicity and the marketing, reaching out, stepping out of your comfort zone, asking people people to read it and review it. And in some cases, those are friends and family. In some cases, those are complete strangers. And, just being open to like, I need help here. I can't do this on my own. And people may say no. People you really care about may say no, right? And it's been such a learning and a growth experience for me. What I would say is just the process of writing the book and just the story has been so rewarding. I mean, it really is true. Like if I don't sell one copy, like if I don't make a dime on this book, to me, it was still worth it. It was worth every second. It was worth every penny because that's the other thing. I mean, you do have to even if you're self-publishing, like you've got to invest some money on the front end, right? It's still worth all of it. The book, I was very honored. We have gotten really great editorial reviews so far. Um, and for one of those, for Literary Titan, they gave it the Gold Award, right? Which and that was not just for fantasy, it wasn't just for sci-fi. I mean, that was sort of for everything. I mean, they were looking at everything that was releasing in that cycle. And it's their job to like read a lot of books and decide which ones are the best. And they said, it's not just silver, but it's gold. And I made an Instagram video when I did that. I'm like, the validation feels nice, and at the same time, it's like you almost have to not need it to get it in a way, right? Again, it's sort of this weird paradox, but all that to say, the buzz around the book has been good. Again, only time will tell in respect to things like sales and like, will it find its audience? Will it go out and like reach a wider audience? I mean, that's what I hope, but we don't know. What I will say is, there's a lot of excitement around it right now, not just from me, not just from the author, and at the same time, I have just been really pleased with. I think I've done as justly by Zeno and Alexandra and some of the other characters as I can, and in that respect, I can sleep pretty well at night.
Love that. Where's the best place readers can find your book? I know some readers love signed copies. Is that an option and the best place to connect with you?
Yeah, so if readers want signed copies, my website is Demitrios Lopez, spelled just like it sounds, .com. Like that's it. Pretty simple, no space, Demitrios Lopez, and just right into the .com. They can find me there. If you put Thumos Rising into Google, the website will pop right up. And again, Thumos is spelled just like it sounds, Thumos. It's a Greek word that I appropriate and sort of rebrand for the purposes of the story. As far as like, what I was going to say is like in respect to the signed copies, reach out to me on the website, send me a message there. Like a lot of authors' website, there's a connect here, and right, it links right to me. You reach out to me, I will get you a signed copy. Like absolutely, just so honored, so happy to do that. And whether there's one or a million and one, I can genuinely tell you, I'll be like just as excited to sign every one of them. I've sent several signed copies out already to some of the reviewers that I connected with on Instagram and just said, hey, just thanks so much for reading this book. I'm, just really trying to connect on a human level, right? If you just want to get a copy in general, it's up on Amazon, and again, there are some bookstores locally that are having the book, and some in places like San Diego, other places like that. But I would just say for the general reader at large, again, the best place to go is just go on Amazon. Again, just type in Thumos Rising. It's going to come right up. The paperback is $18.99 and the ebook is $9.99. Maps are just as good in both, but both of them, the maps are good. I made sure those maps, like these maps have to be legible, right? So many fantasy books, it's just like, okay, I need a map. And then when you have a map, it's like, I can't read this map. It's not clear enough. The maps are good.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We're so grateful that we got to interview you. We'll be sure to drop those links in the show notes. That way everyone can find you. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Courtney. I appreciate it.